Hey everyone, tonight we're drifting back into the softly uncomfortable world of medieval noble bedrooms. So go ahead and dim the lights, get settled, and let your shoulders drop a little. We're not in a hurry. History will wait. It always does. This evening we're talking about pregnancy, or more precisely the awkward, often ineffective ways medieval noblewomen tried to avoid it, and the equally awkward ways they failed, because of course they did. In the Middle Ages, childbirth was dangerous, exhausting, and frighteningly common. A noblewoman could expect to spend much of her adult life either pregnant, recovering from pregnancy, or worrying that she wasn't pregnant enough to keep her position secure. Romance was optional. Heirs were not. And so, quietly, behind stone walls and heavy curtains, people tried to manage reproduction with a mix of folklore, desperation, and wildly misplaced confidence. Let's ease into it. In medieval Europe, the official stance of the church was simple and unwavering. Sex was for procreation, ideally within marriage, preferably without enjoyment, and absolutely without preventative measures. Anything that interfered with conception was, at best, suspicious, and at worst, a fast track to hell. Naturally, this solved absolutely nothing, because medieval noblewomen, especially those at court, were under constant pressure. Produce heirs, preferably sons, preferably quickly, but not too quickly, and definitely not so often that you die at 27 from cumulative exhaustion. So women, midwives, and physicians developed a quiet parallel knowledge system, one that existed in the margins, written in coded language, whispered, passed from woman to woman, often wrong, sometimes dangerous, occasionally effective by pure accident. Let's start with the most popular method, timing. Medieval thinkers inherited their ideas about fertility from ancient Greek and Roman writers, particularly Hippocrates and Galen. These men had many opinions, most of them incorrect. They believed the female body was governed by humors, and that conception depended on balance, temperature, and mystical internal vapors. Women were considered colder and wetter than men. This was not a compliment. According to this theory, pregnancy was more likely at certain times of the month. Which times exactly was unclear. Some texts suggested conception was easiest right after menstruation. Others insisted it was just before. Some argued that avoiding sex during a woman's hot phase would help. Others thought cold phases were the problem. So noble couples attempted calendar-based contraception with great confidence and very little success. A duchess might sincerely believe she was being cautious by abstaining for a few days, and then, 9 months later, be presented with a surprise baby and a deep sense of betrayal by arithmetic. Of course, this confusion wasn't limited to women. Medieval men were equally baffled by how reproduction worked. Some believed women needed to experience pleasure to conceive. Others believed pleasure was sinful and therefore incompatible with pregnancy. Both camps somehow existed at the same time, arguing past each other in Latin. Naturally, they made it worse. Another common approach involved herbal remedies. This is where things get both fascinating and mildly alarming. Medieval medical texts list a wide array of plants said to prevent pregnancy. Pennyroyal was a favorite. So was rue. Also silphium, which may or may not have gone extinct because people used it too enthusiastically as birth control. These herbs were often taken as teas, wines, or pessaries. Yes, pessaries, which is exactly what it sounds like, a small object, soaked in something vaguely medicinal, inserted with hope and prayer. Some of these herbs actually did have abortifacient properties. Pennyroyal, for example, can induce uterine contractions, can also poison you. This was considered an acceptable trade-off. Midwives might recommend a specific dosage, but standardization was not exactly a medieval strength. Too little and nothing happened. Too much and the woman might experience severe bleeding, organ failure, or death. In fairness, medieval life was full of these sorts of calculated risks. This one just happened in the privacy of a bedchamber. There were also mechanical methods. Condoms, in a loose sense, existed. They were typically made of linen, animal intestine, or bladder. Romantic, I know. These were more often used to prevent disease than pregnancy, but the line was blurry. Noblemen, especially those with mistresses, might use them occasionally. Wives, however, had limited control over whether such precautions were taken. Negotiating condom use with a medieval king was not a promising strategy, which brings us neatly to withdrawal. Yes, that method, known since antiquity, discussed endlessly, and trusted far more than it deserved. Medieval moralists despised it. Clergy warned that it wasted seed. Physicians debated whether it worked at all. Men, meanwhile, assured everyone they had it completely under control. They did not. And so many noblewomen found themselves pregnant despite a husband's confident claims that he'd been careful. This phrase has echoed tragically through history. Beyond physical methods, there were charms. Always charms. Women wore amulets made of jet, coral, or carved gemstones. Some contained prayers. Others contained animal parts. A weasel's testicle was a popular choice, for reasons best left unexplored. These charms were believed to repel conception or protect a woman from pregnancy-related complications. Their actual effect was mostly psychological, but in a world where fear was constant, psychological comfort mattered. Even queens clung to these small talismans. When everything else felt out of control, at least you could touch a stone and pretend the universe was listening. Let's pause for a moment and consider the irony. Noblewomen were surrounded by wealth, servants, and luxury, but when it came to their own bodies, they had very little agency. Their value was directly tied to fertility. Too many children and you were worn down. Too few and you were disposable. Take Eleanor of Aquitaine. Brilliant, wealthy, formidable. She gave birth to 10 children across 2 marriages. 10. This was considered impressive. Also exhausting. Eleanor lived into her 80s, which feels less like luck and more like spite. Many women were not so fortunate. Childbirth killed somewhere between 1 and 3% of women per pregnancy. That doesn't sound like much until you remember that noblewomen were expected to have many pregnancies. The odds added up quickly, and yet trying to avoid pregnancy carried its own risks. Church condemnation, accusations of witchcraft, dangerous remedies, social suspicion. So most women lived in a constant state of anxious compromise. Some noblewomen practiced prolonged breastfeeding to delay fertility. This actually works to a degree. Lactational amenorrhea can suppress ovulation. Medieval women noticed this pattern, even if they didn't understand why. So a countess might insist on nursing her child longer than expected. This could raise eyebrows, but it was one of the safer options available. Of course, this only worked if the woman survived childbirth in the first place. Now let's drift gently toward the men in this story, because they were, as usual, very involved and very confused. Medieval medical theory held that men and women both contributed seed to conception. This led to the belief that strong, vigorous men produced better children. Kings naturally took this to heart. A king might avoid bathing, believing it preserved virility, or eat vast quantities of meat and spices to heat his humors, or blame his wife when no heir appeared, regardless of how many concubines he'd exhausted in the meantime. Infertility, in other words, was almost always the woman's fault, even when it wasn't. So noblewomen who failed to conceive might try increasingly desperate measures. Pilgrimages, relics, touching saints' bones, drinking water that had passed near something holy. Pregnancy avoidance and pregnancy obsession existed side by side, sometimes in the same year. One year, a queen might desperately want to conceive. The next, she might quietly hope not to, knowing another birth could kill her. And so she might drink a tea, or wear a charm, or track days with nervous precision. Sometimes it worked, often it didn't, which brings us to the quiet tragedies. There are countless unnamed noblewomen who died young, worn down by repeated pregnancies they couldn't prevent. Others survived but were left chronically ill. Some were cast aside when their bodies failed to perform as expected. History remembers kings, footnotes queens. It rarely mentions the women who tried, unsuccessfully, to control their own futures. And yet they tried, constantly, ingeniously, sometimes recklessly. There's something deeply human about that. So as we let this first topic settle, imagine a medieval bedchamber. The stone walls, the heavy air, a woman lying awake, counting days, touching a small charm, hoping this month will go one way or the other. No science, no certainty, just hope, fear, and a quiet negotiation with fate. Let's rest there for a moment, breathe, and when we continue, we'll drift further into the strange and fragile world of royal bloodlines, where avoiding pregnancy was only half the problem.